Light sleeping was not a habit she had cultivated. It was the result of understanding, at 12, that the court's significant information moved in the intervals between the scheduled things, and that the intervals were often early or late, and that being unavailable during them was a form of ignorance that she found less acceptable than the fatigue the light sleeping produced. She had made the adjustment at 12 and had been making it since, which was 12 years of training her awareness to maintain a quality, even in sleep, that permitted the early or late thing to arrive and be registered before the full waking came. The knock came at the 5th hour and was registered before the waking. She processed it from the specific state of light sleep's edge, the knock present, the knock's identity in the processing producing the result before she had fully decided to wake. The knock was not the guard's knock, which she knew from 3 years of the palace's rhythms as the knock of someone at the outer corridor's checkpoint announcing a perimeter update. 3 sharp knocks with the authority of someone who expected to be heard. It was not the attendant's knock, which was 2 soft knocks and a pause, the knock of someone who was announcing their presence and was prepared to wait. It was 1 knock, a single knock with the quality of someone who had decided on this knock after considering others, and had chosen the one that would wake her without announcing itself to the corridor. She processed this. Someone had thought about how to knock. She was awake. She took the robe from the chair beside the bed, which was where the robe was when the bed was occupied, and she went to the door with the specific alertness of someone who was awake and present at the 5th hour and was not performing the waking. She opened the door. Eran Dovel was in the corridor. He was in the work attire rather than the court attire, which told her the night had been a working night rather than a sleeping one. His expression was the expression she was developing a reading of across 2 months of his posting. The expression of someone who was managing something, and who was in the management's current state, which was different from the court's expression, which was always the expression of someone presenting a managed version of the management. He was not presenting. He was at her door at the 5th hour, and he was in the problem's presence rather than in the presentation of the problem, and the difference was visible. She said, "Come in." She stepped back from the door and he came through it, and she closed the door behind him, and there was a moment of the 5th hour's specific quality. The palace's overnight quiet, the corridor outside in the rotation's change interval, the room in the ambient of the pre-dawn that was not fully dark and was not yet light. He said, "I've been awake since the 2nd hour. I want to give you the full account before I ask the question." She said, "Yes, give me the full account." She sat on the chair beside the desk, which was the working position rather than the formal one, and he stood in the space the room provided. Not the position of a guest in a superior's room, which would have been the position nearest the door, but the position of someone who was in a room to address a problem, and who had placed himself in the position appropriate to the problem's address, which was the room's center. He said, "The Joint Authorities Secure Communication Relay at the Imperial Court's Western Technical Station. I've been running a scheduled maintenance verification since the 1st hour, which is the window the relay's architecture requires for the verification to run without interference from the court's daytime traffic. At the 2nd hour, the verification identified a decryption error in a stored transmission, a transmission that arrived 4 days ago and was logged as received, but that the relay system flagged as potentially corrupted at the storage level rather than the transmission level." She said, "The corruption is in the stored data, not the original signal." He said, "Yes. The original signal was clean. The storage's decryption layer produced an error that the relay's standard recovery protocols are designed to address, and the standard recovery protocols are not addressing it." She said, "The protocols failed." He said, "The protocols are running and are not producing the restoration. They've been running since the 2nd hour. In approximately 90 minutes, the transmission will reach the archive threshold, the point at which the relay system reclassifies the stored data from active to archival, and the archival reclassification means the restoration approach changes from recovery to forensic reconstruction, which is a different process that takes significantly longer and which may not produce a complete restoration. She said, the transmission's content. He said, the transmission is from the Joint Authorities Frontier Assessment Division. It contains the third quarter security assessment for the Eastern Corridor. The assessment is scheduled to be presented to the Court's Security Council at the 9th hour this morning. She said, 5 hours from now. He said, yes. The presentation requires the decrypted transmission's content. If the restoration doesn't complete before the archival threshold, the presentation either proceeds without the assessment-specific data or is postponed, and the postponement has operational implications for the Security Council's current review. She said, and the official channels. He said, the Court's communications officer is not available until the 7th hour. The Joint Authorities Technical Division's emergency contact is not responding. I've tried 3 times. The relay's maintenance staff has a 5th-hour rotation change that means no one is at the Western Technical Station between the 4th hour and the 6th. I've been to the station. I've worked with the recovery protocols for 2 hours. I've reached the limit of what I can do with what I have, which is the relay's architecture and the standard recovery tools. She said, and you need the cryptographic approach. He said, yes. The recovery tools have been running against the corruption's surface. The corruption is in the decryption layer, which means the surface approach is finding the error and can't address it because the error's source is underneath the tool's reach. The cryptographic approach would go to the source, she said, and you came here. He said, I considered the options for approximately 40 minutes. The options that involved official channels are exhausted. The options that involve technical approaches within my competency are exhausted. What I have left is a cryptographic problem that requires a cryptographic competency I don't have. He said, I was at the Joint Authorities Technical Exchange Program's final presentation 3 years ago, the Cryptographic Systems Modules Capstone project. You presented the 3rd project. She said, yes, he said. I was in the audience for the program evaluation. I was there for the 4th project's evaluation and I arrived early. She said, and you heard the 3rd. He said, I heard the 3rd. I was at the back of the room and you were presenting to the program's technical faculty. And I was the Joint Authority Liaison Observer in the back row, and you didn't know I was there. The 3rd project's approach to the cascade decryption problem was not the approach the program's standard curriculum produced. She said, no, it wasn't. He said, it was significantly more sophisticated than the standard approach. The faculty's response to it suggested they were encountering the specific solution for the first time. She said, they were, he said, and you put it in the program's archive. She said, it's in the archive. He said, I read it at the 2nd hour when I identified the corruption source in the decryption layer. The approach in the archive is the approach the relay's specific corruption requires. She said, and the person who developed it, he said, is the person I knocked on at the 5th hour. Yes, she looked at him. He looked back with the quality she had been reading across 2 months. The quality of someone who was in the problem, and was present to the problem, and was not managing the presentation of the problem, and who was also in the specific quality of the 5th hour and the empty corridor, and the single knock that had been chosen from other possible knocks, in the quality of someone who had decided to trust something and was in the decision. She said, tell me what the relay's architecture looks like in the decryption layer. He told her. He told her in the specific technical register of someone who had spent 2 months with the relay's architecture, and who understood it at the level that 2 months of active engagement with a system produced. The level of someone who knew where the layer boundaries were, and what the layer interactions produced, and where the architecture's standard assumptions lived, and where the specific installation's deviations from the standard assumptions were, which were the deviations that the maintenance verification had been checking for. She listened in the specific quality of someone who was receiving technical information and was building a model from it, which was the listening that had a different quality from attending. Attending was receiving and holding, and this was receiving and assembling, and the assembly was visible in the questions she asked, which were the questions of someone who was filling in the model's specific gaps, rather than asking for clarification of the account's general shape. She asked, the decryption layer's key management. The relay at the Western Technical Station, is it running the standard Joint Authority key rotation, or is it on a site-specific cycle? He said, site-specific. The Imperial Court's installation uses a modified cycle that the court's security requirements produced. The cycle is documented in the maintenance protocol, but the documentation is, he found the word, incomplete. The cycle's parameters are in the documentation, but the implementation-specific behavior under the verification conditions is not fully described. She said, that's where the error is. He said, you can tell from the description. She said, the cascade decryption problem in the capstone project was a site-specific key rotation issue. Different installation, same category. The standard recovery protocols are designed for the standard key rotation. They're running against an implementation they weren't built for. He said, yes, that's consistent with what I've been seeing. She said, what's the transmission storage format? He said, standard Joint Authority archive format, Tier 2 encryption. She said, and the corruption is in the decryption layer's key reference, not in the encrypted data itself. He said, yes. The data is intact. The key reference is what's broken. She said, can we get to the Western Technical Station? He said, yes. The rotation change created the gap I used to reach you. There's no staff at the station until the 6th hour. If we're there before the 6th hour, we have the station without interference. She said, how far? He said, 11 minutes at the palace's internal corridor pace. 8 if we take the direct route. She said, the direct route goes through the service passage. He said, yes. It's not, it's the less formal route. She said, it's the route that doesn't pass the guard's checkpoint in the secondary wing. He said, yes. She said, you've walked it. He said, I learned the palace's layout in the first 2 weeks. The service passages are in the maintenance documentation. She said, of course they are. She stood from the working position chair and went to the room's secondary wardrobe, which was where the practical attire was rather than the court attire, and she took the practical attire in the efficient way of someone who was dressing for a function rather than for an occasion. She said with her back to him, the system interface at the Western Technical Station, is it the standard console or has the site-specific installation modified the interface as well? He said, the interface is standard. The modification is in the back-end architecture. The console's controls are the Joint Authority's standard layout. She said, good. The approach in the archive was built on the standard interface. The back-end adaptation will be the variable. He said, how significant a variable? She said, depends on how the site-specific cycle was implemented. The capstone approach is modular enough to adapt, but the adaptation requires understanding the specific deviation. That's your contribution, you know where the implementation deviates from the standard. He said, yes. She said, so we need both. He said, yes, that's what I calculated. She turned, dressed in the practical attire with the quality of someone who was ready to do the work required. She said, 40 minutes to the archival threshold approximately. He said, 47 as of 3 minutes ago. She said, then we have time to do this correctly rather than quickly. He said, I was hoping you'd say that. She said, correctly is how it gets done. Quickly without correctly produces a second failure. He said, yes. That's what the 2nd hour through the 4th produced. She said, the direct route. He said, yes. She went to the door and opened it, and the corridor was the corridor of the 5th hour's rotation change, empty, the overnight quiet at its latest and most complete, the palace in the specific stillness that it achieved only in this interval. They went through it. The Western Technical Station was in the palace's administrative wing, not the ceremonial wing, not the residential wing, the wing that housed the functions that kept the palace's operations running and which had the specific aesthetic of a space designed for the function rather than for impression. The station's interior was the standard Joint Authority technical installation. Consoles, relay equipment, the ambient of active systems in the specific hum of the maintenance verification, still running on the primary console. She looked at the primary console's display, which showed the recovery protocol's current state, the protocol running, the error flagged, the data intact beneath the corruption that the protocol was encountering and not addressing. She said, "Show me where the key reference is." He showed her. He knew the architecture well enough to navigate to the key reference's location directly, which was the 2 months of working knowledge, and which produced the navigation without the search delay that would have added to the interval. The key reference was where she had expected it from his account. She read it. He watched her read it with the quality of someone who had been working with the problem for 3 hours, and who was now watching someone else see it for the first time, and who was monitoring the seeing for the specific moment when the seeing produced the approach. She said, "The site-specific cycle. What's its period?" He said, 17 days, she said. "And the standard is?" He said, 30 days. She said, "The key reference is pointing to a rotation position that the 17-day cycle doesn't produce because the standard recovery protocol was built for the 30-day cycle. The protocol is looking for a key that exists in the standard cycle and doesn't exist in the site-specific one." He said, "Yes." She said, "The archive transmission from 4 days ago. Where in the 17-day cycle was day 4? He checked. He said, "Day 4 of a cycle that started 13 days ago. The cycle is currently at day 17, the rotation's final day." She said, "So the key the transmission was encrypted with is the key from 13 days ago, which is the key at day 4 of the previous cycle, which in a 17-day cycle is a key that has, she calculated, been rotated out of the active key store." He said, "Yes." She said, "But not out of the archive." He said, "The key archive holds," he checked the documentation, 6 cycles. She said, 6 17-day cycles is 102 days. The transmission is 4 days old. The key is in the archive." He said, "The standard recovery protocol should be accessing the key archive." She said, "It is. It's looking in the wrong place. The standard protocol uses the 30-day cycles archive indexing. The site-specific cycles key archive has a different index structure because the rotation period is different. The protocol is looking in the 30-day index and finding nothing because the key is in the 17-day index." He said, "So the key exists." She said, "The key exists. The protocol is looking in the wrong place. What we're doing is telling it where to look." He said, "How?" She said, "The capstone approach has a re-indexing module. I didn't use it in the presentation because the problem in the capstone was a different variation. In that case, the key had been corrupted rather than misfiled. But the module is in the archive's implementation, and it works for both cases." He said, "You built the module for the corruption case, but it also handles the misfilling case." She said, "The module's function is to locate the correct key by working from the transmission's encryption signature backward to the key's identity rather than forward from the index. The index is the problem in both cases. In the corruption case because the index entry was damaged. In this case because the index is the wrong index. The module bypasses the index entirely." He said, "Can I access the archive's implementation from this console?" She said, "It's in the Technical Exchange Programs archive, which requires the program's access credentials." He said, "I have those." She said, "You have the program's observer access." He said, "Yes, I was the liaison observer. The observer credentials include archive access." She said, "The archive includes the cryptographic systems module's project submissions." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then access it." He accessed it. The archive loaded. The capstone projects were in the archive in the sequence of their submission. The third project, her project, was in the sequence. She opened it. She said, "The re-indexing module is in the 4th section. I'm going to read the implementation to the console's adaptation layer." He said, The adaptation layer accepts external implementations. She said, the site-specific installations modification added the adaptation layer. It's in the maintenance documentation. He said, I read the maintenance documentation. I didn't read it as a potential input point. She said, most people read maintenance documentation for what the system does. The adaptation layer is for what the system can accept. Different question. He said, I'll remember that. She was reading the module's implementation to the console's adaptation layer with the quality of someone who was doing something they had done in a different context, and were translating the doing to the current context in real time, which was a specific cognitive activity that required both the source knowledge and the current context knowledge simultaneously. She was doing it with the quality that practice produced, not without effort, but with the specific quality of effort that was competent rather than straining. She hit a point at the 14th minute where the translation produced an inconsistency. She said, the site-specific cycles key archive. The storage format, is it the standard joint authority archive format or the site-specific format? He checked. He said, the key archive is site-specific format. The installation documentation has the format specification. She said, read me the format specification. He read it. She listened with the assembly quality of someone incorporating new information into an active model. She said, the module needs a format adapter between the re-indexing output and the key archive storage format. I didn't build one for the capstone because the capstone installation was standard format. He said, can we build one? She said, yes. It's not complex. The formats are related. The adapter is essentially a translation layer. The complexity is the time it takes to implement correctly. He said, how long? She said, 20 minutes if I don't make mistakes. He said, we have 31 minutes. She said, then we have time to do it correctly. He said, what can I do? She said, the format specification. I need you to call out the field definitions in sequence as I implement the translation layer. I'll write the implementation. You verify the specification against it. He said, I can do that. She said, yes, I know. They worked. The work had the specific quality of two people who had not worked together before and who were finding each other's working style in real time in the context of a deadline. He called the field definitions with the accuracy of someone who was reading a technical specification and whose primary commitment was the accuracy of the reading, which meant when he was uncertain. He said he was uncertain and asked her to verify rather than guessing, which was the quality of someone who understood that the specification's accuracy was the work's foundation. She implemented the translation layer with the quality of someone who was in a technical problem and was solving it from the problem's actual structure, rather than from a framework she was imposing on it, which produced an implementation that was adapted to the actual system, rather than to the system as she had expected it to be. At the 23rd minute, she had the format adapter. She loaded it into the module's implementation. She ran the module. The first attempt produced an error at the key archive's access point. She read the error. She said, the access point's authentication. The site-specific installation has a secondary authentication requirement for the key archive that the standard implementation doesn't have. He said, yes. It's in the security protocol section of the documentation. I should have mentioned it earlier. She said, what's the authentication requirement? He said, the maintenance verification token. The verification that's been running since the first hour. She said, it generates a session token. He said, yes. It's running on the primary console's secondary partition. She said, can you pull the session token? He pulled it. She incorporated the session token into the module's access call. She ran the module again. The second attempt produced an error at the index translation's output format. She read the error. She said, the output format. The reindexing module's output is in the program archive standard format, but the adaptation layer I wrote assumed the system would accept the standard format. The site-specific system wants the format I translated from. He said, The adapter runs the wrong direction, she said. The adapter runs the correct direction for the input. The output needs the same adapter running in reverse. He said, "Can you reverse it?" She said, "In approximately 4 minutes, yes." He said, "We have 12 minutes." She reversed the adapter. She ran the module a third time. The third attempt reached the key archive. The third attempt identified the correct key index. The third attempt failed at the decryption call. She stared at the error for a moment in the quality of someone who has made 2 correct steps and encountered a third obstacle. She said, "The decryption call. What's it showing?" He read it. He said, "The decryption call is using the standard call syntax. The site-specific installation's decryption layer," he checked the documentation, "has a modified call syntax. The modification is in the last section of the installation notes." She said, "Read it to me." He read it. She modified the call. She ran the module. The fourth attempt reached the key archive and identified the key and made the decryption call in the correct syntax, and the decryption call returned a value, and the value was the decrypted transmission, and the transmission's content was present in the console's display in the clear text of a document that had been sitting in a corrupted state for 4 days and was now legible. She looked at it for a moment. He looked at it for a moment. She said, 22 minutes to the archival threshold." He said, "Yes." She said, "We have margin." He said, "Yes." He sat down in the chair beside the console, not the working position she had been in, the chair of someone who had been standing for 3 hours and had arrived at the point where sitting was the available thing. She said, "Secure the transmission. Update the recovery protocol with the approach. The relay's next maintenance verification will need the adapted module in the system." He said, "Yes." He said it in the quality of someone who was in the completion, and was also in the completion's aftermath, which was the aftermath of 3 hours of a problem that had been solved, and which had the specific quality of the solved problem's release. He began the securing. He began the protocol update. He worked with the efficiency of someone who was completing the final elements of a significant task, and who was doing them correctly because the final elements were part of the task. She sat in the operator's chair and looked at the transmission's clear text on the display, and at the decryption module's successful completion indicator, and at the console's clock, which showed the 5th hour's latest interval becoming the 6th hour's earliest. Outside the station's windows, which faced the palace's eastern courtyard, the sky was beginning the specific transition that preceded the dawn, not the dawn itself, the transition that was the sky's preparation for the dawn. The quality of light that was possible only in the interval between the night's depth and the day's beginning, and which lasted approximately 20 minutes and was, in the quality of the 5th hour's ending, the most specific indicator that the interval was ending. She watched it. He completed the securing and the protocol update at 13 minutes before the archival threshold, 13 minutes of margin. The problem solved with 13 minutes remaining in the window that had been 90 minutes when he knocked on her door. He said, "The transmission is secured. The protocol update is logged. The recovery approach is in the relay system for future reference." She said, "The maintenance verification." He said, "Still running on the secondary partition. It will complete at the 7th hour as scheduled." She said, "And the court's communications officer," he said, "will be available at the 7th hour also." She said, "The Security Council's presentation at the 9th hour," he said. "Has the assessment's data?" "Yes." She said, "Good." She said it in the quality of someone who was in the completion's presence and for whom the good was the good of the thing having been done rather than the good of a managed conclusion. He said, "I want to say something." She said, "Yes." He said, "Before I knocked on your door, I spent approximately 40 minutes working through the options. I went through the official channels first because the official channels are the correct first approach. When the official channels were exhausted, I went through the technical approaches within my competency because those were the next correct approach. When those were exhausted, I sat with the remaining option for 40 minutes. She said, "Why 40 minutes?" He said, because the remaining option was coming to you, and coming to you at the 5th hour with a technical crisis required, he found the word assessment, whether the request was appropriate, whether the relationship between us was the relationship the request required, whether I was asking you to do something that served the problem or was asking you to do something that served my assessment of the problem, which would not be the same thing if my assessment was wrong. She said, and the assessment produced the knock. He said, yes. The assessment produced the knock after 40 minutes because I concluded that the problem was real and the approach was accurate and the relationship, he found the word again, had the quality that made the request possible. She said, the quality. He said, trust is the available word. I'm aware it's a word with significant weight in the context of a joint authority liaison and an imperial princess, and I'm using it carefully.